everyone. Welcome to the Fairlawn Jewish Center Congregation B'nai Israel. I'm Rabbi Rachel Salzman. I'm the rabbi of the synagogue. I am so excited to be co-hosting in our synagogue this event with the Gross Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Ramapo College of New Jersey. I'm pleased to introduce my friend, Dr. Geder Avos. Dr. Rubin directs the Gross Center. He researches and writes about Jewish life in communist Czechoslovakia. Jacob reached out to me last August when he arrived, hitting the ground running with the Gross Center and how to integrate the program at the college with the local synagogues. We hit it off right away. Jacob and I have had several wonderful conversations about our Czech Memorial Scroll and the program as a whole, and I know that he's been very helpful to Rabbi Roth in his research on Hatzov, where our scroll is from. Jacob also contributes actively to discussions of contemporary anti-Semitism, nationalism, and Jewish diaspora. In addition to his articles, book chapters, and reviews, Jacob has published 2 edited volumes, Jewish Property After 1945, and with Rabbi Dr. Shmuley Yankowitz, Jewish Veganism and Vegetarianism. Jacob earned his PhD from Washington University in St. Louis under the direction of Dr. Hill Kival. Jacob has held research and teaching positions at Youngstown State University, Penn State, Charles University in Prague, and the Center for Research on Anti-Semitism in Berlin. Jacob grew up in Montville, New Jersey, and is pleased to have returned after 27 years away with his wife Meg and their dogs Charlie and Buster.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Rabbi Salzman. It's quite a pleasure to be here, to make your acquaintance, and to start working with you. This is exciting for me on a number of grounds. First, my mom grew up in this community. I spent many years spending Yom Kippur at B'nai Israel on Pine Avenue, which merged into the synagogue for those of you who are guests. It's also exciting for me because this is where my direction of the center meets with my own research as a scholar. I've been researching a lot about how the Czechoslovak government, the Czechoslovak Jewish communities, and American and Israeli Jews living abroad but looking overseas struggled to deal with the fate of Jewish cemeteries after the Holocaust, after the devastation of communities, when there was no one to care for the cemeteries. These cemeteries could be a burden, but they also offered opportunities to mourn their losses as a community. Something like over 20 Holocaust memorials went up in these cemeteries in Czechoslovakia alone by 1957, at a time when that's known for suppression of discussions of the Holocaust. These spaces gave controlled room for Jewish communities to mourn their losses and to think about their futures. I'm writing a piece now about attempts by Jewish communities from America and Israel and abroad to intervene behind the Iron Curtain to protect, rebuild, and maintain these cemeteries. And in doing that research, I came across an organization named Geder Avos. And through that, I met Rabbi Moshe Yosef Rubin, whose grandfather of the same name founded the organization. And he kindly invited me to speak with him at his home, shared with me some documents, explained to me more about his grandfather's thought and his own, and what he's now doing with that organization and the cemeteries in Europe. So it is with great pleasure that let me tell you something about Rabbi Moshe Rubin, excuse me. Rabbi Moshe Yosef Rubin directs Geder Avos, the organization founded by his grandfather and namesake, who was born in Bukovina in 1895 and passed away in Brooklyn in 1980. The goal of Geder Avos is to preserve the heritage of Central and Eastern European Jewry, with a particular focus on restoring and securing Jewish cemeteries. Born and raised in Brooklyn, Rabbi Rubin, the one we have with us, earned a BA in Jewish Studies and a rabbinic ordination from Machol LaTorah VeHaOrah under the auspices of Avram Bosner. He descends from the Hassidic rabbis on both sides of his family. Rabbi Rubin is a board member for the European Jewish Cemeteries Initiative and the Israel-based Ohelei Tzadikim organization. He chairs the board of INXTG, Israel Next Generation, His publications include Der Geder Avos, The Life and Times of Rabbi Moshe Yosef Rubin, a father to so many Hassidim, the story of Rabbi Mayor Drizin, and Celebration 75, a dynastic history of the Rubin, Hager, Rokeach, and Horowitz families. I will add that I am finding Pardes Yosef, a collection of his grandfather's writings, absolutely inspiring, thoughtful, and challenging. It's written in Hebrew. I find the Hebrew extremely accessible, so if you are at all knowledgeable, I think you'll enjoy it as well. I want to thank once again the Fairland Jewish Center for hosting and invite Rabbi Rubin to speak to us tonight. Thank you very much.
Hello everyone, good evening. We say Potchim B'chvod Achsanya. We open with honoring the hosts. Thank you to the synagogue, the Fairland Jewish Center, to the rabbi, to everyone who came, and of course to Professor Labins for his interest in my grandfather and his work and his life, and for interest in what I do. I don't very often publicly speak, but this is good, I think. It pushes me to do so, and I'm happy to do so. So thank you for coming. My grandfather, as Professor Labins mentioned, I'm named after him, so I obviously did not know him. He was preceded my birth, his death, by 5 years. But I'm named after him. I was raised with his energy around me. I'm raised by his son, his youngest son, and I'm the youngest after 7 older sisters to my parents, and an only son. So it was very, very much a presence in my life. And when I tried to describe to people what type of man he was, what type of rabbi he was, what type of Jew he was, I often think of a story that I once read of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. He was a great Jewish ethicist and sage in Lithuania in the 19th century, and someone came to the rabbi and asked him, why is it that in former times the rabbis were physicians and men of general culture, and today they're confined to the Daled Amot Shel Halacha, the 4 cubits of halacha. They're not out there. So the rabbi answered, he says, I have another question. How come in former times the physicians and the men of general culture were rabbis? Right? So it's an interesting observation. So there was once this schnit of rabbi who were wholly observant, above a label really, ultra-Orthodox, though what we would call ultra-Orthodox, but very much not isolationist Orthodox. They had a wider worldview. I always say they were able to zoom out in today's words. And it caused them to have a more nuanced approach to things. And they viewed themselves as rabbis for Klal Yisrael. Whether they were a very powerful rabbi or an old rabbi sitting at a desk in Bar Park. They were of the Jewish people, by the Jewish people, for the Jewish people. And it kind of gives a different perspective. It's not, my group versus your group. The group is the family of the Jewish people. And my Zaidi, as I call him, was very much one of those rabbis. He was born in 1895 in Galicia. Galicia was a province of the Austrian Empire, to a very Rebbish family, what we would call a Rebbish family. They were the Hassidic masters for generation after generation. Everybody was Rebbes until my grandfather, who was a rabbi, not a Rebbe. That was his rebellion. And then his sons one was a doctor, one was a scientist, so things changed. But my grandfather was an old world Jew in that way. He grew up as a toddler, they moved from Galicia to the next province, which was called Bukovina, also part of the Austrian Empire, and he grew up in this town called Siret. Siret, if anyone reads Jewish newspapers from the 19th and 20th century, which I tend to do, Siret comes up a lot. It was a prosperous town. There were many interesting Jews living there. It was a little town with big people. And he was influenced there by others, not just his father and that crowd, but he had exposure to other thought. And one of them that really captured him was the thought of Shamshon Kolberg, of Torah and Derech Eretz, which he became a great student of that teacher. And he ended up later in life translating the works of Hirsch into Romanian. So he was an old world Jew, he was a New Age man. As a young man, he went to university, which was very not the norm for children of Rebbes. And if they did go, others that went never came home. Isaiah came home and with his full lavush, because he was taking the wisdom around us but incorporating it into the Torah life, not feeling challenged by it at all. And he, as a young man at 28 years old, he was elected to become the Rav of one of the big towns in Bukovina. He chose to run for this specific town, and today it's called in Romanian Campulung, in Yiddish Campulung. And he picked that town because it was the most modern town. It had a white-collar crowd and an enlightened crowd and Hassidic. It was a mix, but he felt that he had the best chance there to make a significant change versus the next town where he would just be like the next rabbi. And he was there from 1923, very activist young rabbi. He founded Hebrew schools and renovated all the mikvahot and was very, very interested in the young people, in the youth. He said intelligentsia. He would like to debate and to talk to them and to, in one of their recollections, one of the students writes that he would speak of the three books open in front of us, which is it's a play on a Gemara. He's paraphrasing. But my Zaydi's three big books were the book of history, the book of nature, and the book of books, the Torah. And he said that if one can grasp the light of the Torah, the white, he would say, in between the black letters, then when one looks at history, one sees the hand that writes the story. When one looks at nature, one marvels at the exactitude of nature and sees the providence of the divine, really. And that was this is his general thought that he saw it in. That's how he lived. And eventually his activities expanded. He became, they had like what we would call a provincial legislature. So he was elected by his community and a few others to represent him. He was a gifted linguist. He wasn't Romanian really, because Bukovina became Romania when he was in his 20s, but he learned excellent Romanian, and he spoke and debated all these people in parliament and advocated for Jewish cause. That's what he was into. And then eventually he became a member of the Romanian Red Cross. I'm giving a picture of what he was doing in his good times. And then he was even involved with the Romanian royal family. He was awarded what was called the Officer of the Romanian Crown. It was this, I have it at home, it's a certificate with you have to see how the prince and kings wear those. So he got that for his work, his social work. And then he became a member also of the Moetzet Gedolei Torah of Agudath Yisrael at a very young age. Agudath Yisrael was a political party, is a political party, but in those days it had a little bit of a broader base. There was a liberal wing to the Agudath Yisrael, not religiously liberal, but politically liberal. And he was a member of Agudath Yisrael. And then, of course, the world came to an end as they knew it. And I'll give a little bit of a geopolitical summary. It might be known, but I think it's valuable in the context of this conversation. In 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Non-Aggression Pact. Romania, as the closest military and political ally of Germany, was part of the pact. And as part of this pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, so I referred to, Romania had to relinquish to the Soviets certain lands that they had annexed after World War I. They weren't truly Romanian lands. They weren't part of their Agudath, old Romanian kingdom. Part of these lands were northern Bukovina, which had its capital city, Chernovitz. I'll explain why I'm saying this, and it's very unknown these days. My Zaydi once was interviewed by a Yiddish paper here after the war, and he said Romania in Yiddish is an almana. And he says almana in Hebrew is, the etymology of almana is ilem, one with no voice. And that's why the Torah is so worried about all those with no voice. And he said Romania's story, even today when I tell people my father was in Romania the whole war, where did he survive it? I said he was in an apartment in Bucharest, it's unki. But that's an unknown story even all these decades later. It's more known, but yet very mysterious. So, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Chernovitz suddenly is Russian for this brief period. Chernovitz was an incredible city. I've been there twice. It's a beautiful city. It was a German city. It was a Jewish city. It had over 40% of the population Jewish. It was, I think, 70-something thousand Jews, 80 shuls. My Zaydi's brother-in-law was the chief rabbi there. And it was very prosperous. Jews liked to live there. It was a liberal city. They did very well. It was industrialists, lawyers, many. And suddenly they're living under communist rule. They didn't like it. The Russians, asserting control, started to send people into the Russian interior, the elite and the bourgeois, what they called. My father had a first cousin who was caught in the street selling something and sent for 7 years to Siberia. He was lucky. They didn't know that he was lucky, but he was lucky. But many of these connected Jews financially and politically, they wanted to get out of Chernovitz, and they smuggled themselves out to be on the Romanian side of the border. Even though Romania was Hitler's ally, it was considered to be the better place than in Chernovitz. So a group of these wealthy Chernovitz, they're Yidden Jews, ended up in Bucharest, the capital. Keep that in mind. My grandfather did not live in northern Bukovina. He lived in southern Bukovina, which was unaffected by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. So he was sitting in Romania. But then, in October of 1940, which was a few months later, there was something called the Iron Guard in Romania. It was a right-wing, I guess we would call it like a fascist gang party, to the right of the Romanian dictator, Antonescu. And they, in Bukovina, were agitating against my grandfather. I don't know what it was, and they said that the Jews need to go to shul on Rosh Hashanah, and need to close their shuls on Rosh Hashanah and open their businesses. So absurd demands, and they ignored them. And on Yom Kippur of 1940, they stormed into the shuls in Campulung. There was 3 or 4 shuls that they stormed into, and they opened these legionnaires, they called themselves, they opened the Aron Kodesh, the Ark, and they discovered pre-planted guns and ammunition, and said that the Jews of Campulung were planning a riot or a revolt, which was absurd. And they had a document for him to sign. He wouldn't sign using his kittel. He was a little document in Kippur, he wouldn't sign it. And my father's brother remembered it very well. He said the legionnaire took out his pistol and held it, and he said, "I'm not signing the document." And then one of the pros of Romanians is that they're very transactional, and they're also superstitious. So one of the peasants there knew my grandfather. My grandfather had quite the image. I'll maybe click him on here. That's him on the right, with his father in the middle, and his brother-in-law. He was scared, and they put down the hand, and they didn't shoot him. But they took him home, and they ransacked his library. He had an incredible Judaic library, which he spent all those decades with. They just threw everything in with furniture onto a wagon, and they tied him and his 18-year-old son, harnessed them in place of horses, and made them schlep through the town. It was, in the early days of the war, it was like an appalling event. Now, my grandfather had very strong historical consciousness. My uncle didn't want to leave. Why should they leave? He was there for 20 years, nothing happened. You know, it's very hard, even today when there's something happens, it's not easy to contemplate moving, especially as a Rav. But my grandfather said he's not staying there. If this could happen to him in such a way, in such a public spectacle. So he said, this was Yom Kippur, he says, by the end of Sukkot, I'm not here. And him and his wife and their 2 children went to Bucharest as well. Now, in Bucharest we have now that group of Jews from Chernovitz that I mentioned earlier, with my grandfather as the only Bukovinian rabbi. I say Bukovinian because the rites were very different. They were more Hassidic ethnically in Bukovina, and they didn't have a shul that they could go to together, and they connected with him, these expats from Chernovitz and him. And the reason I'm going into such great detail about that is because this group of Jews and my Zaydi ended up creating what was called the Vadat Salah, the Bukovinian Committee, which is unknown. You can Google it, and it's at Yad Vashem, but it's relatively unknown. And what happened is, just to condense it, a few months later, the next Shmini Atzeret, so we're now talking Shmini Atzeret Tafshin Bet, 1941, October. They're in shul, in his new shul in Bucharest. He opened up a shul. They rented an apartment with 9 rooms, my father said. That's where my father grew up, in that apartment, and they knocked out the walls, and they had a pretty decent shul. And a woman runs into shul. She's the one that gave the testimony at Yad Vashem. Her name is Rivka Rottenstein, and she has a Romanian officer with her, and she's hysterical, holding a postcard, and runs to my Zayd to the road, and says that her father, who lived in one of the towns in Bukovina, is telling her in this telegram that he paid the officer to take, that they are deporting the Romanians, not the Germans. The Romanians are deporting the Shtetlach in trains, and no one knows where they're going, and it's mayhem. And my Zaydi and these Jews, and I'll mention their names just because they were such real tzaddikim. They were, by the way, mostly secular Jews that were in the crowd. Sumer Wolf. I said to my dad, what type of name is Sumer? He says, Itamar. Sumer. So I said, oh, okay, Itamar. Herr Schwalik, Natan Klipper, Sammy Baraf, big names, Yitzhak Lustig, Shula Friedman. There was a big group, Chaim Weissman, and they sat down and said, what are we doing? You remember, there's 150,000 Jews in Bucharest. It sounds like they were somewhat affluent even. They lived in normal, and they're hearing. See, in other places, there was a lot of breakdown of communication. People didn't really know in the moment of what was happening in Lodz and in Warspit. It was crazy. Here they knew, or they knew that something was going on, so they decided, Sumer Wolf actually said a good idea. He said, let's ask this officer to go back and to scout for us. We'll pay him. And he came back. Long story short, he came back. He said they're bringing them all into Ukraine, which once Hitler broke the non-aggression pact, they invaded the Soviet Union and started to conquer Soviet territory. It was Soviet proper territory. So there's a river called the Dniester, which separates Romania and Ukraine, and they Transdniester, or Transnistria, was this other area where they sent hundreds of thousands of Jews, not labor camps, not death camps, ghettos with no food, and it was a horrible winter in 1942. Everybody knows that. Any World War II historian will tell you that. And my grandfather and his fellow community members, they created this committee, and they banged down every Jew in Bucharest door, give us money, we're going to send provisions, we're going to send food, we're going to send medicine, and they had this whole clandestine network of Romanian officers going into these places. And it's interesting how I know about it. During coronavirus, I did not go to work. I was really scared of it. I stayed home for many months in my basement, and I had time. I calculated at least 2 hours of time that I never had, and I never will have. And I said, let me do something valuable with time. So my Zaydi had around 1,000 pages of writings that were in his trunks. And I started to go through it. It was fascinating. And we put it together into the book that the professor mentioned, Rabbi Moshe Yosef. But as part of the research project, I wrote a biography about him at the back. And I found this book. He had a damaged copy, but I was lucky to find the complete copy at the National Library in Israel. It's called in Romanian Ganduri Sikuventari, Speeches and Thoughts. And it was a book published in 1944 for the 25th anniversary of his rabbinical activity. During World War II, still raging, but Romania had switched sides at that point. We'll get to that. And it's memories of these committee members writing, very fresh. It's very interesting for me to read something written then versus all these books that we read now. Sometimes there's agendas or things seem differently, or even histories. In hindsight is 2020. It's interesting to read it in the moment of it, and they all write about all these incredible activities, and people that were interested in history are writing how they reacted when the committee members' messengers came. They said it was like they were with who died mostly. Their young children and the elderly. That's who died. Tens and tens and tens of thousands that winter, and the thousands that lived give a lot of credit to this effort. So that was one part. Then Romania switched sides. The Allies were losing. They overthrew Antonescu. They joined the Allies. My father says, as a little boy, he was running into the shelter from the British bombs or the American bombs. Then it became the Germans bombing Bucharest. But because it was now an Allied country, many Jews began to come to Bucharest. Thousands of refugees. And again, he made the new committee and housed them and said everybody who has a big apartment must take in a refugee. He said, the history is judging you. The Melech HaMishpat is judging you, Hashem. And he succeeded. But then he had a new problem. There was a bunch of youth going around, and they Bittul Torah, they were wasting time. And he said, there's nothing worse than wasting time, so we need to make a yeshiva. So this was quite unique. The war is raging, and there's a yeshiva being made in Eastern Europe, which is, I don't know of another comparable moment to that. It's like a Yavna moment. This is what we do. We're going to teach our next generation. And there was, I think, almost 200 boys in the yeshiva with some fascinating pictures. I should probably click. That's the shul in Campulung. That's him in Bucharest. That's with his students in the Bucharest shul. These are the committee people. That's one of the yeshiva pictures. And the man, so he's with the white beard holding his hands on the cane. The dark bearded man to the left is Rabbi Safran. He was the chief rabbi of Romania, later of Geneva. And my father is a little boy with a sailor suit under his dad. And then here's another picture. The man, it's interesting, I think the boy, the teenager holding the sign on the other side, is named Rabbi Yosef Shapiro. He ended up being this very famous Israeli Chaver Knesset. Manya Shapiro, they called him, Rabbi Rabbi Yosef Shapiro. He told his kids about this yeshiva, what an incredible moment it was for them. I'll get back to that family later because they reappear. And that's my grandparents after the war in Prague with their children. So this was his story during the war. But then the communists took over Eastern Europe, and he quickly realized, again, the historical consciousness, this is not a place for us to be. And he disbanded the yeshiva, and he got them papers. They should all go mostly to Eretz Yisrael, to Palestine, which was dangerous, and a lot of them had to wait in Cyprus, but they got a lot of them out. And then he and his family, he dreamed of going there. He was a great Zionist, great lover of Eretz Yisrael, which was not so accepted in his, but he so understood the moment of it then and what it would become. But he ended up in the United States. He came here in 1948, and he was in a much diminished role. He didn't have his brothers; they were all killed. His father, his brothers, his friends, his whole. It was ironic because Hassidic Rebbes had followers that were following them. Pulpit rabbis, communal rabbis. The American rabbinate was much different. They didn't have like a shtat rabbiner, like a city established. We don't have that really here. So they found themselves in trouble and in a new place and very much diminished in their ability to do things. But he became the Rav of Shul. He was lucky. In Long Beach, Long Island, my father grew up in Long Beach, Long Island. But again, he was a rabbi, like I said before, of Klal Yisrael. So he was thinking the whole time bigger than his immediate surroundings, and he realized that these rabbanim, these rabbis, were destitute and unable to get other jobs. They couldn't become insurance brokers, but they just didn't know. They were old men. They barely spoke the language. So he founded this World Center of European Rabbis, which initially worked with the Claims Conference to help the rabbis process their paperwork for reparations. It was daunting. It actually started with German government directly, then the Claims Conference kind of joined the conversation, and he got a lot of, I think he signed up 400 Rabbanim to get an enhanced pension that would help them. And you know, today, it's incredible because my father was signed up with this group that, you know, but the German government today, like my father's elderly and needs care, and if I just say it to everybody that I see, if anyone has an elderly relative who's a Holocaust survivor, the German government pays for home care, which is a tremendous piece of knowledge. I found it to be a very big deal. It could be incredibly expensive. So if it helps anybody, and you know, it was interesting. I worked on Lubavitch, and I looked once. I was wondering what did the Lubavitch Rebbe say about reparations, because Menachem Begin was very against it, and the Lubavitch Rebbe was generally more on the right wing of politics in that sense. And then I found this letter where a woman writes to him that she wants to know she should take reparations. He says, "They're ganavim, take them. What more, what better? They stole the money. They stole so much, take it from them. It's not a problem to take money from them." He had no issue with it. Not only that, he said it's like, take what you can. So, and it doesn't do justice, but at least people are helped. But anyway, I'm digressing. So, at this point, in the 1950s, he started to receive reports somehow, I don't know the exact sequence, of Jewish cemeteries in Europe being, several of them, many of them were destroyed by German soldiers in vandalism. Some were destroyed by war, just collateral damage, not purposely necessarily. Others were destroyed or ruined by locals who took the stones to build foundations. You know, even today I get pictures that are like unbelievable. They come to a big building and the whole basement is just like fascinating. Not say but. And then in the communist era, they were used for development, real estate development. So often, this is actually Professor Lavinson like we sometimes bought from the communities the remnants of whatever remained of these communities, which wasn't much. And he was very, very disturbed. So disturbed that he kind of dedicated his last 20 years of his life to this cause. So I think the main point that I want to say tonight is why would a man who clearly I just exhibited was about Jewish life, he was about teaching Jewish kids, he was about building community, about the eternity of the house of Israel, Jewish phenomenon, why would he be so taken by such a cause? Sentimentality? He wasn't very sentimental. He wasn't. I read his writings, it was not. Historical preservation doesn't deserve 20 years of such immense. But he felt that in these sites, and even more than in the sites, in the sensitivity to care about the sites, there is importance for Jewish existence and for Jewish future. And I would even say, I thought about this before I'm saying it, he attributed mystical significance to it, cosmic significance to it. This is not a simple thing, and I'll explain why. And when I explain it, I usually think of the Mishnah in the Ethics of Our Fathers in Geder Avos, which says, "Da me'ayin bata, v'lama tavolech." Know from where you're coming and to where you're going. Me'ayin bata, where you come from. Jews were not very into history. I don't know if people realize that. In the hundreds of years that we lived in Europe, definitely in the earlier centuries, very few historical works by Jews, but were masters of memory. Masters of memory. Like, just think of Kiddush, think of everything we do, the Seder. Memory is very important. There's this good book called Zachor by Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, who explains the nuance between history and memory. History, in short, is you know something. You know something, you can learn it. Memories, you feel something. And it's a much deeper faculty. And if someone feels something deeply, it can be internalized and become like a core element of identity, really. And in these sites, he felt like, look, we were in Europe from the fall of Jerusalem to the rise of Hitler. This is like millennia of Jewish life. And we can't, if we just say, okay, so then what? And what are we connecting to? And it's also about like gaining a perspective of where the person stands, of where I fit into the Jewish story. I feel this with people all the time. When a Jewish person feels their placement, like this was my grandfather, this was my grandmother, this is where I come from. It's very empowering for what? For that Jewish person's life as a Jew, and continuing the Jewish tradition. I saw this great clip, I'm digressing a little bit, I just remembered it, by Rabbi Steinsaltz, and he's talking about being a Jew. He says there's two ways of saying I'm a Jew. One is, I'm a Jew. I have hemophilia. Something I got from my parents, I don't particularly like it, and I definitely don't want to pass it on to my children. And then he says there's another way of saying I'm a Jew. I am a prince, or a princess. It's something that I got from my parents, right? The way princes do, and I definitely want to give it to my children. But in order to give it to my children, I need to marry a princess. And there's that whole, and that, a lot of times you feel that with, I think, in genealogy, but really in that sense of belonging. And I think the genius of rabbinic leadership throughout the ages has been that past, future, two-way vision of where you come from and where you're going. And where you're going, not just a Jewish future, but Lana Talef, when we stop in Jewish burial practice and we purify the body, we bury the body, and then we maintain that cemetery, right? That Bet HaKfarah. What are we saying? What are we declaring? We're declaring that the story doesn't end here. The story doesn't end here. There's more to the world than that which the eye beholds. There's a greater calling. There's a bigger story, right? And if we were to treat human bodies the way we do with other material remains, we could be corrupting our humanity. And humanity, there's this famous line, there's nothing more crooked than the timber of humanity, right? But there's nothing more sacred either, right? In the Torah, the soul is eternal. See, in the Torah, life is that which is eternal, that which is true. In biology, it's exactly the opposite. What is alive? Something that has a lifespan. So there's an appearance of life, and then there's the truth of life. And we believe, essential to our existence, that there is a bigger story in what we are here for. And that was really, I think, the essence of why he felt so strongly for it. So what happened? He started to write to everyone under the sun, literally. He wrote to all the rabbis, to all the politicians, from councilmen to assemblymen, to Henry Kissinger, to the president. You know, he had no problem writing them. He had great stationaries, and he wrote to them and he said, this is just awful, and help us. And then he had this other big goal, which was to get the West German government to pay for the reparations. And he flew to Bonn with Rabbi Pinchas Kaitz, who was a founding member of Geder Avos, and he was a good friend. He always was on his radio show. And Rabbi Hollander, and they apparently had, I'm just quoting the newspapers, they had 1 million signatures, and they spoke before, my grandfather spoke before the Bundestag, a committee, but they wouldn't give money. They had all these different, it was like a 20-year correspondence. They wouldn't give money. We didn't destroy it, it's a Soviet problem. We don't want to invest in there was Ostpolitik. They had the problems, and there was the Cold War. They didn't want to invest in foreign plans, and really what his Geder Avos succeeded with most was Sur Meira, raising awareness, saying to people this is unacceptable, know about it. There were 20,000 cemeteries. I one time read, I don't know if this is verified, that there are tens of millions of Jews buried in Europe. Might make sense, think about it, every generation. So it continued until his passing in 1980, and then it petered out. His nephew continued it a little bit, but it didn't continue much. In 2006, I was 21, went on a trip to Europe for a month with a friend, and I wanted to go to all the shtetl that we came from. And because we were rabbis, it was a lot of shtetls, because nobody lived in the same shtetl. It was dozens. So we went to Poland and to Latvia and to Belarus and Ukraine and Romania. You couldn't do that today, where we drove. Impossible. I remember we drove through a town and it was Chernobyl, and I rolled up the windows. Rolled the windows. That would have helped, but I guess we didn't do it. And I came to Ukraine, to Transnistria, to Mogila, where his father was buried. Let's see if I have anything else here. This is just, I'll get to that soon. Anyway, I found his father's caver. His father, who had passed away in November of 1941, with an original headstone in a mausoleum, never visited by any of his children or grandchildren until I came, 65 years. And I feel, in retrospect, I went on a history trip, but at a certain point it turned into memory for me. Suddenly I was like, wow, look at this, look at that. And I was moved by it, and it was in bad shape, and a few other sites. And I came home and I called a few of my relatives and friends that would have been interested in such a thing. I wanted to raise money, I want to fix these few sites. They wanted a tax receipt. So, thus was born the newer version of Geder Avos. And one thing led to another. I connected with an Israeli organization who had workers on the ground, because after the Cold War, a few organizations sprung up, but they did, and they did great work. I was one of them. A job here, a job there. There was a heavy concentration on kivrets that became graves, right? But it was sometimes sad that you came to a cemetery and there's a beautiful mausoleum renovated, and then like the whole cemetery is neglected. But there's different schools of thought. And some people say, no, if we can't do the whole thing, at least we do that. They know that it's here. Some people say, no, if you do that, then they'll think the rest is hefker, or you know. But a lot of work was done, and there was a watershed moment in 2016, that Rabbi Shapira that I showed you before in the student picture, his son, who's sitting here on the bottom right, is named Isaac Shapira. He's this incredible activist, an Israeli businessman, lives in Zurich, in London, and Tel Aviv. He was awakened to this issue, and he said, what could be done to solve this problem, but like institutionally, not, you know, a little here, a little there. So he put together this board, which I'm part of, and chief among them is Dr. Yossi Beila. Anyone is familiar? He was the former chairman of the Meretz party in Israel, former justice minister, deputy foreign minister. He had some. He was very active in birthright. He thought of birthright. It was his brainchild originally. Also the Oslo Accords, and he had great governmental connections with Germany from his service in government. And all those years later, there was a different German government. It was a much, much wealthier German government. There was no more Iron Curtain. And Rabbi Shapira and the board succeeded in getting them to agree to €1 million a year of fencing center. We fenced 263 cemeteries in the last 7 years. We're going to do 300 this year, and many, many more. The European Union joined and gives also a grant every year. And suddenly we see a plan where we can tackle. So that's the board in Tel Aviv. Rabbi Shapira is sitting there with the German ambassador. There's the woman next to him. I'm sitting there, and Colette Vital is the bottom right, and Yossi Beila next to her. Look, but it's a good rainbow of a meeting. Jews from all different walks of life, and everybody cares about this. And I think that, as my grandfather felt, it awakens a certain sensitivity, more than just the actual work. It's a special thing to be involved with. That's my father meeting with him in Brooklyn. And then, interestingly, to close, my role kind of is I bring in foundational support, private support to augment the governmental support, the main. And I'm dealing with these great Jewish givers, philanthropists, and I'm like, okay, so I'm just going to fence cemeteries with them. I mean, it's nice, but there needs to be, there's only so much we could do with fences, right? So Chabad in Israel has an incredible network of work, like they do everywhere, but in Israel it's just all that much more unbelievable. And there's 3 platforms that work with kids in high school, mostly not observant kids, high school, and the IDF, which is between high school and university, and then in university. And we have these incredible platforms with 75 full-time shluchim, couples working to what Israel, and in Israel it's a very sensitive topic. Secular Israelis are I saw a good line, they want yoter yahadut v'pachot kfiyah. They want more Judaism and less forced Judaism, but they do want Judaism. They want Jewish identity, and like one of them said, why else would I want to live here? And why else would I want to serve in the army? And why else would I want to marry Jewish? So we do that work, and I started this other organization which takes up more time than the cemeteries, which I think is what he wants, really, what he would want. And I do, by the way, this is not my full-time occupation. I do work. This is just hobbies that really became much of what I do. And I enjoy this much more than real estate in the Bronx. So that's the story. And I'll end with a story I read in his writings, in Isaiah's writings. He writes of a Frenchman after the French Revolution, years later. Somebody asked him, what did you do during the French Revolution? What was your role? So man says, I survived it. And he wrote this 52 years ago, and he said that the job for us now is that in 50 years we should say we survived it, and that we're Jews. And surviving doesn't necessarily mean a crisis. Sometimes it's harder to survive the lack of a crisis than a crisis. And that's my story. And I'm Yisrael Chai. I'm here. In Jerusalem, lighting some memorial candle.
So there's time for questions from the audience.
Yes.
Okay. I have a question. I know I was in Poland last week, and I met with Rabbi Shudrick, and so there's a whole initiative now in terms of the cemeteries in Poland. Are you linked with that? Because
Yes.
It's very impressive.
Yes. So the Poland, Rabbi Shudrick works very closely with our CEO, Phil Carmel, who is the CEO of the initiative based in Ukraine. Until last year, much of our work was in Ukraine. Obviously not now, but more and more in Poland, and we do a lot of joint ventures together. Yes, in Poland there's a much more organized local effort.
Who's your contact in Poland?
Rabbi Shudrick.
No, I know that.
Oh.
I thought you were saying he works with your
Oh, he
organization.
works. So
Yeah, who's the person he connects with?
on our end, his name is Phil Carmel. Phil Carmel is the CEO of this initiative, which I'm a board member at. He runs the day-to-day operations. He's based in England, and there's an office in Kiev, in Ukraine, and they work very closely together. Yeah. The European Jewish Cemeteries doesn't just come into the country and start buildings. They work with the Kehillah, they work with the government, and if there's too much issues, they just move on and don't do that site because there's too much going on to stop.
Is this basically for preservation and not allowing people to build on top of cemeteries or shopping malls, etc.? And do you also do searches for graves that somebody may think exists somewhere?
So there's a couple of points to that. The initiative that's funded by Germany, this main initiative, is only for fencing. It's demarcating. We send an engineering team, and interestingly, ironically, one of the sources is the Luftwaffe photographs that they took. Aerials, which is a vast database, and we can see, not just can we see the cemetery, we can see Ohalim, mausoleums of these famous tzaddikim, whose grandchildren want to know where was that, and then we see, oh well, there it is. So that's what we're doing mostly. Right now, we are fencing. We don't have work inside. I've done many projects with other partners of restoring an inside of the cemetery, meaning raising up the stones. We did one around the Baal Shem Tov's Kever in Mezhebush, 2,200 stones in the ground. In Lubavitch, in Russia, 700 something. We've done it. It's much more complex to do so. So the initiative doesn't do it because they would be bogged down doing so, but there's small organizations that do it. There's some arguments of how to do it. Some people are very offended if they put down concrete bottoms, like foundations. It kind of ruins the look or the. I don't really have a strong opinion on it. I think if the work is done and it's done with a good intention, as long as they're not desecrating it, it's fine. Now, with regard to looking for it, you can reach out to me. I can ask. It depends where. Some of them are so destroyed there's nothing to look for. Some of them are very much some of them are intact.
What do the local populace think about this?
I know.
Sorry.
I'm sorry.
I'm gonna get. I skipped over. My bad. I'll give them extra time. The local population is a good point. So there's a lot of effort that goes into that. A lot of the European Union grant is spent on local education projects. Remember, a lot of these kids, even young adults, or even baby boomers, don't remember having Jews in the town. And they're fascinated by it. If you ever saw, there's a book, The Atlas of Hasidism, fascinating book by Marcin Lodzinski, I think his name is. Beautiful atlas. And he said, and he goes into very interesting maps and graphs, and he says what triggered his interest. He's a Polish, non-Jewish man. He said, seeing the cemeteries. And he says, like, what is this? Ooh, what are these strange letters? So there's a lot of educational programs. They talk about it a lot. I haven't been to much of them, but Dr. Beila has told me how he's been, and Ukrainian kids are telling me how they go and clean the sites and they cut the grass, and they've given honorary citizenship to Rabbi Shapira in various towns for the interest in the town. They value it for the most part. I have to call. Yeah. I'm not. This is my first time doing this, so yes. I'm sorry.
So, can I understand, so you don't deal with Poland, that's a separate?
No, we do. But in Poland, it's in tandem with local kehillah.
So are they doing the same thing as you?
No, so we're not going to duplicate
Are
work.
they in Poland?
In Poland, there are several branches, different areas in Poland are under different organizations. It's a little bit more complicated in Poland, but we've, in the last 2 years, done quite a number of jobs in Poland in cooperation with the community, with Rabbi Shapira.
So if you say you fenced in all these hundreds of...
The 263, majority was Ukraine. Majority was Ukraine. Just, there's Jewish geography and then there are real geography. So Galicia, which is a big center, is southeastern Poland and southwestern Ukraine. That is where a lot of it happened. But we've done also in I'll just list the countries if it's interesting. We've done work in Belarus, in Russia, which is also not happening anymore, in Poland, a lot in Ukraine, a little bit in Romania, more and more in Slovakia, a little bit in Czechia, and now we're going to start projects in Georgia, even, which was a Sephardic community.
Matter of fact, talking about Poland, I happened to go on a trip when about 18 years ago with a whole group that there was Rabbi Mendel Rubin outside, and I went with the Reichberg family, and he was the first one in 1970s that started marking
Working,
and
by the way,
clothing.
Rabbi Reichberg worked for Mazedi. He
Yes.
was above our chassid.
Yeah, I know. I'm over but it doesn't matter. But
I'll tell you
we,
something.
you know, we I don't look. It doesn't matter. It's here in the heart. And so we went for 3 days, 4 days really, 3 nights, 4 days, and we went to 25 Zionei Kever of Rabbonim that he marked. It was, you know, we drove on a bus, we stayed on a bus day and night, and for 3 days till the Yortzeit of this, and it was amazing how he has in every town, he has somebody, some goy
Caretaker.
or some old Jew that stayed, you know, in town, is the only Jew in town, that pay them to care for the cemetery. It was unbelievable. You know, you say I don't know more, but I went with 180 yoilis, you know, from Kiryat Yoel. You know, I was the only one in this. It doesn't matter. I was
Your
I was the attraction in the whole thing. Because
So,
what are you doing here?
Exactly.
And then when I told them I'm a nechet of Rabbi Mendel, they all went, wow, you know, like they
Interesting. So it's good you brought that
But
up.
it was wonderful.
The Bukovina Rebbe, Reb Shlomo Albershan, was one of those refugees that came to Bucharest. Where did he live? By my grandfather for months. And he was extremely close with him and forever indebted to my grandfather, to the extent that my grandfather is buried in their cemetery because he insisted the Rebbe, he says, I need him to be buried here. And when Geder Avos was founded, he was very active with it. I have many letters from him, from the Bukovina Rebbe. And Rabbi Reichberg was introduced to this work. I've spoken to his children. I don't think the older man is around.
No. I went
By
with the children.
Rabbi
I went
Rubin.
with the children.
Right. So their father, because of the bub of friendship, that's how he got involved. But this work that he did, what I alluded to before, which were these small organizations that did work, amazing work, in the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s. But it was Kivrei Tzadikim.
Yeah.
It wasn't this,
wasn't
and it's
everybody.
not to discount it. I did it. I did
See,
dozens.
you take care of
Right.
Rabbonim.
I did dozens of such sites.
He
Yeah.
made
Right.
the
Right. And that's another angle of it. Yes, Rabbi Friedman.
This may take us a bit
Just to
to
say,
a slightly different.
Rabbi Friedman was my father's chavrusa in Torah V'das. So I have special. What?
He was the strongest little yid you could ever imagine.
Oh, really?
He was constantly kvetching something.
Oh, boy.
He always worked on it. He wasn't a natural athlete. I was. But
It wasn't in his
outdid
genes.
us. He was doing push-ups, pull-ups.
Oh boy.
You know. But he was a great chavrus. It was great to be with him. Great.
Nice.
He married my wife's best friend.
Yes, true.
He told you I did.
No, you.
You? Oh, really?
Yeah.
I'm still teaching you. But that's a different issue. Thank you for that. My question may take us a little to a place you don't want to go, and that's fine. Any comments on American Jewish initiatives, outreach to Hillel, to youth groups, to SDSY, or United Synagogue? Is any American Jewish organization, group, federation picking up this torch?
So I know that in my grandfather's day, he did work with National Young Israel, and he would always note in his adverts that they were sponsored by all these different American Jewish organizations. I don't. It could be I should. I generally operate somewhat behind the scenes. I don't talk about it much, which could be a chisar, and it could be a deficiency on my end. I think that we're doing a lot, and the American Jewish organizations are doing a lot where they're doing it. So if we needed, urgent support, I think, but I'm not, I think that it's in its proper place of importance, meaning it's there, it needs to be done, and I try to explain why it's so important, but I don't do much outreach in that way, but I'm open to feedback. Yes, Rabbi.
I'm formulating this as both the rabbi of the synagogue and also on the board of my family burial society. And thinking of my mata where you're going from. What educationally, as we move forward, as we bury our loved ones and then move away, I see that as with our shul cemetery, that we have people who used to belong to the shul that now live on the other side of the country. How do you have a connection to the graves that you did not visit and you might not even know, other than all of our ancestors are being fenced by your work? And it's
So
great
note
to-
how to feel that connection,
Yeah.
how to make it more personal.
Yeah.
So I think the question is more than the grave, it's to the person first
Yeah.
of all. The question is to the person. The grave is just the resting place of a person. So how do you feel connected to one's ancestors? Right? How do you feel connected to one's, I think if one is connected to their parents, it's a good start. And then the grandparents are just, I think I've seen in talking to people, when they discover Jewish genealogy, and that's where they came from, or it sparked something. It could really, my mom says a thing she heard once from Rav Breuer's son, Mark Breuer, gave a shiur in Tannersville, where they summer, and he said, Parshas Matas Maseh, the Jews are going from one stop to the other stop to the other stop, and it's like, okay, so every pit stop, it's like, and the Torah is exact. There's no such thing as just listing towns. So he said a very nice point. He said, when you tell a Jew the shtetl that they came from and that they heard about from a grandmother or a place, it's suddenly like, oh, it's a special thing. Right?
Yeah.
And that's why when the Torah says those places, these station stops are very important. It's a good question because just to answer, if all of us would have a strong connection, then I think we'd be in better shape, right? And that's the challenge. It's not an easy answer. Yes.
It's going to be our last question.
Could you describe exactly what you do when you get the grants? Like, on the ground, what happens when a cemetery is
Sure.
allocated?
Right. So we have a list. So part of the EU grant, which is different than the German grant, is to survey the cemetery. So we have this incredible database of surveys. What does it mean, survey? Someone goes down there, they do a survey of what's going on, because a lot of the old data is outdated, so this is updated. This is this town, this is the perimeter, this is the caretaker, there's visible stones, there's no visible stones, photographs, and then sometimes drone imagery, which is great. And then, once the site list is finalized for, let's say, 2023, there's going to be around 37 cemeteries that we're going to do, right? Rabbi Shapiro wants to hit 300, so we have to do. So what happens? There's two surveys. There's an engineering survey, which figures out the boundaries, delineates the boundaries, which is super important, because the worst thing to do would be to make a gate and then to find out later. And that has happened, not with us, but that has happened. We fixed gates, and then 20 graves are outside. And graves don't mean matzevot. Graves mean burial plots. Maybe if the matzevah was destroyed, that doesn't make it less sacred or less special. Imagine. And then there's something called a rabbinical survey. I'll show you this guy's, the rabbi sitting on the bottom right, next to Rabbi Beila. His name was Rabbi Ginsburg. He worked for Rabbi Schlesinger of London and Bethlehem, and they are experts on this. So it has a halachic approval. Everything is done halachically. And then an engineering, actually, then a team comes in, they put it to tender with local contractors, which is also good for us because they appreciate it. And then they give us a quote. And I'm not involved in that aspect. I'm more involved in the list part. But then they build a cemetery. They construct a fence. Depending on every town will be different. A lot of times the mayors have specific preference how it should look.
Do they reassemble the tombstones?
No, so that's what I was saying before. So we don't reassemble. The ESJF, the European Jewish Cemeteries Initiative, does not reassemble the tombstones. We're fencing. We're fencing. If in a specific case there is a group of people that want to do that, and I understand why one would want to do that, then I have another organization that I would work with in that case. But it's more complicated because the stones, you need a lot of expertise, but I've done quite a few of those. Much less than the fencing. Okay? Thank you.
I'll just close very quickly, although it's not really the Fairlawn Jewish Center, they can often close after me. But my portion of the closing is first to thank Rabbi Rubin for coming and speaking to us. It was a fascinating conversation. I gained new perspective about what I'm writing. I'm glad we did this before I wrote. I'll tell you that your grandfather caused a major panic in Czechoslovakia in 1972 because they wrote a letter and they assumed that he was like the chief of the Jews in America. And it went, they had their usual fall guy. It was an amazing story that I think I shared with you some of it already. Last thing I'll say, again, thank you to the Fairlawn Jewish Center. It's a pleasure working with you, Rabbi Stalson, Thorin.